Today coming up, everything about limiters, when to use them, when not to use them, how they actually work, and how they can improve your mix.
Head underwater, with my eyes wide open, hazy-eyed from dreaming.
Hey guys, welcome to the studio. It's really sunny out there and warm. The first day I'm not wearing a jacket. I slightly regret it, but it's fine. I didn't freeze to death. Good sign, summer's coming up, which is nice, but I still prefer just being here in the studio and working on new music. So today is a full music production day, just sitting here making music for the entire day, probably just starting new drafts since my other release is now all finished and ready for release. And since I already showed you that a million times, how to start a track from scratch, how to build up the drums and like start with the chords, the melodic parts, the guitars, everything is here on this channel. I thought to continue another series I started with like basics. I did one with EQing, showed you everything about EQing, how it works, when to use it, when not to use it. The same also for compression, and I think today I will take care of a special kind of compression that is actually limiting. When to limit, how to limit, where I use it in my tracks and where I don't use it. So first up, some really simple theory, really basic, really quick. If you look at an audio waveform, a compressor, it picks up the peaks, the ones that are sticking out the most, and is compressing them, so pulling them down with a certain attack, release, and a threshold where you set when it starts to pick up those peaks and how to squeeze them down. And then at the end of the compressor, it's then just making the entire signal louder. So it's basically bringing up the things that are more quiet in an audio file. So for example, someone singing really quiet and then really loud. With a compressor, you can make the quiet parts louder or the louder parts quiet and then everything loud again, just to get a more equal file at the end, which is really handy for music production because the voice isn't perfect. People sing louder or quieter, move back and forth from the microphone, and with compression you can compensate that. You can also give things a certain character by compressing them, but that's really all already discussed in the compression tutorial. Now, limiting is a special kind of compression. It heavily compresses a signal and is stopping any signal at a certain point. That's why most limiters are brick wall limiters. It's like having a wall next to your audio file and pushing the audio into this wall. So you can set a threshold, usually 0 dB, to not make it clip, because if you go above 0, it clips. Clipping again is like a hardcore form of limiting. It just cuts off the peaks of your audio and you will hear artifacts and clicking, which is really not desirable, especially if you work within the DAW. Digital clipping is really disgusting. If you have an analog mixer, you can clip it and get like clipping distortion, which actually can sound nice and saturate your audio file. But usually 0 dB is your limit, and the limiter is pushing the waveforms closer to that limit. The more you push the limiter, the more it squeezes the audio against that wall that you set up. So it basically makes everything loud, and in a stupid way, I, for example, use the limiter on every single track at the very end of my mastering chain, just to make sure nothing goes above 0 dB. So this right here is my auto load. If I go into the mastering chain, you can see there is the L2. It's a limiter by waves. It is always set up in this way. The threshold is at 0. This means it doesn't do anything. And the out ceiling is where you push your audio signal to. So let me just take a track and drag it into Logic just to give you an example. It's actually my next signal that I can't play to you, so I have to make it quiet. So here on the output channel we have now -5 dB, so still a little bit of headroom. Now it's -4. And with the limiter, we can set the out ceiling. If I reduce the out ceiling, this really reduces just the maximum loudness this track can have. So I can go to -20. And then in the mastering chain, it also reduces it by that amount. But really, usually it's at 0, maybe just like 0.1 below. This might prevent clipping on certain devices, CDs back in the days, and yeah, nowadays actually you can go with the 0. And the only thing I set up is the threshold. So I lower it, and the more I lower it, the more it starts squeezing the audio against the out ceiling. You can clearly see that. Now the out ceiling part is entirely filled out. If I go back down again, there's headroom. If I go down, it really squeezes it in there. You can also see by how much it is actually reducing it here in this meter. Then you have like the quantize, the bit depth, dithering, shape, and other settings. Some limiters, for example, the one from Logic, has less settings even. You have the output level, the gain, release, and look ahead. But basically every limiter out of the box, you just set up the out ceiling, the threshold, and you're good to go for your mastering chain. Now at the moment the L2 is set way too strong. It starts pumping and the audio sounds really bad. So if you're using a limiter, be careful with it. Yes, it lets you control your dynamics, but it will also hurt your dynamics if you exaggerate it. So here in this case, I open span, my analyzer, and you can see the RMS, which is like the average loudness, is at -7, which is, yeah, a tiny bit too much. I think some spin-in tracks go that crazy, but I like to have a little bit more dynamic, especially now with Spotify having a set values for the loudness, so it doesn't matter that much anymore to push your track as loud as you can. So here on the mastering chain, I would just go for -10 dB RMS. That's fine, that's ready. You could actually put this now out there.
You don't have to stay. You don't have to stay. You don't have to stay. Picking up the pieces, shut it on the ground.
So all done with the song idea at the moment, just like a loop with all of the elements, guitar. I also made my own little shaker with a surprise egg, one of the bigger ones. I also have these egg shakers you can buy, but they are higher in frequency. I just needed something that is more dull. Only disadvantage, this is so big you can't like shape the tone by holding it in your hand. With the small one, you can change the tone. With this one, it's too big, but I like it for like the dull shaker sound that fits nicer in the mix of this song because it's moodier, darker. It's actually more again for the winter time for the end of this year. But anyways, let's get back to the limiters, when to use them and where I actually use them. As I said, I use them on every single track at the end of my mastering chain. I think that's everyone doing. That's like the last thing in your chain, no matter what music you make, is usually a limiter to make sure it doesn't clip. And despite that, I actually don't use limiters, like very, very sparely. I prefer using a compressor any day because you can have like the vintage sound of a compressor, give it a little bit of tone and character. Way more control with a compressor. A limiter is really just limiting. The compressor can shape, you can set the attack and release to your liking. And you also have the ratio that you can set in a limiter, it's fixed. In certain cases, I'm using a limiter on groups. So for example, if I have a drum group and I want it to be limited more than the rest of the song, I will have on that group a limiter, push it hard, and then have the vocals, for example, or the guitar less compressed, less limited, and do slightly less on the master then again. Or if I have another group that is just like having too many spikes, I put a limiter on top. Certain instruments sometimes, but usually I try to avoid it. A limiter is just like the last rescue to just not make it clip. I know a lot of people that use limiters on their groups to do the gain staging and everything, but in the digital world, it isn't that important anymore. So I think a limiter at the end of your song, yes. Other parts of your song, maybe that's totally up to preference. Maybe you guys can just let me know where you use a limiter in your productions. For me, it's really mostly the end of the song. So yeah, I think that's it for today. I will now just go outside, enjoy the last little bit of sun for today. And tomorrow we will see us back again here in the studio Don't forget to check out the other videos about the EQing and compression. I will link them down below if you haven't watched them already.
You don't have to stay.